morning, ladies and gentlemen. We should start our panel because the time is out and we are going quite quickly. There are so many. Thank you very much for choosing this panel this morning, this session. We have got quite an eclectic session on the basis of the title, but we try to simplify it as much as possible, and I hope it will be successful. And professionals, the panelists are guaranteed for that. I am the moderator of this small session panel. My name is Benczes, and I think we are broadcast here. I was many things, Hungarian diplomat during the accession talks, then member of the European Parliament in the Economic Committee, and State Minister for Foreign Economic Affairs. Today I teaching at the Károly Reformos University here in Budapest, and I have the privilege to be moderator of this panel, and I hope it will be quite interesting. What I would like to communicate at the beginning, before I introduce the other panelists, that we are broadcast live to YouTube. So everybody can follow what we are talking. I think it will be registered, and later on it could be also reviewed. So not only live, but it will be registered as well. You can look back if you are interested in. And we can see what we talked about, but it will also give another responsibility to me and to us, namely that if somebody would like to take the floor, always have to use micro. That's very important message at the beginning. Secondly, we try to be as brief as possible, and I will give the floor to the panelists who will make an introductory speech, but I will ask them not to be longer than 15 minutes. In the end, maybe it will be 18, but really not more what they want to talk. It can be shorter, but not longer, because I would like to give you the possibility to comment what you heard, or even to address questions to the panelists. And we have to finish it in 90 minutes. We had to prolong the recess because the previous panel has finished just when we should have started. But I think there will be a plenary after our panel at 12:30. So that is the plafond, the limit of our discussion. So may I introduce the panelists? Next to me is Louise van Schaik. She's coming from the Clingendael University, and she was one of the perpetrators who committed a short paper addressed to this conference, a message to the Hungarian presidency, namely on the conditionality, about this budgetary conditionality and conditionality, which will be, I think, in the future, a very important word, conditionality, the EU life. And I can see that in Central Europe or even in Hungary, the so-called conditionality, not speaking about democratic or institutional conditionality, is not very well interpreted or understood. I could listen to the enlargement panel just before this panel, and I could see that welcome from the region as well. It is always the question that how it comes up, how we shall interpret it. So she will have a short introduction on this and tell us something about the topic, namely that why she committed this short message in that paper. Anyhow, you are coming from the Clingendael Institute, as far as I know, Dutch. Nobody is perfect, as we know, but it's only a joke, and we shall see the European Championship. Next to her, I will follow because I am a big fan of the Dutch team. Okay. Next is Miklós Losonc, professor of the Budapest Business University or University of Economics. I don't know what is now the up-to-date message. I think it is not the Corvinus University, but the Budapest University of Business, but it's a very old-fashioned university, and he is head of the PhD school and very well-known Hungarian analyzer on strategic and economic related strategy issues. So thank you very much, Professor. Come here. Then next, Ákos Kenya, professor as well. And he is coming from the university, so closer to us in the neighborhood. And he is big expert for us on budgetary and regional policy and cohesion issues. He has written several books. And now he has chosen to talk about the budgetary challenges for today. And also we have got Professor Benczes. She's also coming from the Corvinus University, if I understand that.
Yes.
Ah, okay. And yeah, so you are at home, partly. And he will also have his message to us. So I don't want to go deep side because it is not me who you want to listen to. It is not my role talk. Maybe I will also have some comments analyst and before making my Fidel Castro type of speech, I will give the floor to Louise. Louise, you have got the floor. Please introduce to us to your thoughts. Thank you. I give you the micro. Everybody should use the micro. That is the most.
Yes, no, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this pre-presidency conference in Budapest. I think it's a great opportunity for us just after the elections to reconvene and exchange thoughts and insights. And we also know that 2024, of course, is an extremely formative year like 2019 was for, let's say, new ideas popping up and these ideas, of course, also have to be translated into budgets and possibly new investments. So I wanted to make use of the opportunity to talk to you today to say a few words about the conditionality paper that I've written together with my colleague Saskia Hollander. For her, it's very easy to identify her as Dutch because she has such a surname.
Yeah.
For me, it's also easy because I have a surname that's unpronounceable for the rest of the world. So that's easy. But then I also wanted to say just a few words about the industrial policies ideas that are floating around and how we look at these also from, let's say, the Dutch perspective and what are the big challenges, because I think it would be interesting to have a bit of discussion about. So you're right, I work for the Clingendael Institute, just to mention, for those of you who don't know Clingendael, we are both a diplomatic academy, so we train the Dutch diplomats, but also diplomats from many other parts of the world, Western Balkans, Caucasus, Central Asia, India, lots of places. And we are also a think tank, and in the think tank capacity, we focus on European affairs, but also international security and conflict studies in the fragile states in the world. So I have many colleagues who've also some of you know and have encountered. So with regards to with regard to the conditionality issue, it occurred to us that this was popping up all of a sudden in various places, and usually it's referred to as cash for reforms. You know, the EU will give you money. And there's carrots and sticks, but the carrots we don't really know about yet because there's no funding for carrots, but we also have sticks. So if you want to have money, then you need to do, you know, all kinds of reforms. And this was an approach that was very much favored by my own country, the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is usually not a big fan of higher EU budgets. And when the idea came up after COVID to do the recovery funds, the Netherlands was not a big fan. And I said, well, at least then if we're going to do joint borrowing on the capital markets and if there's going to be loans, then at least we need to make sure that, you know, the Italians reform their economy, the Spaniards and, well, basically all other countries in Europe need to then also improve the situation. So that's a bit akin, you know, the IMF model, World Bank model. We give you loans, we give you money, but you need to reform. Please come up with these reforms. And usually these reforms were already in the reports of the European semester of the IMF and so on and so forth. But then all of a sudden, of course, it was realized that there might also be a few things that are on the list for the Netherlands, like, for instance, our mortgage credits or our labor markets flexibility issues. Yeah, we're also kind of a bit struggling with this. And in addition to that, we have some issues in the Netherlands with environmental regulations from the 1990s, which cause big headaches for farmers and others in the Netherlands. And we think maybe there should be a bit more flexibility and national ownership about how, so that was a bit the situation. But then we also started to look into this conditionality issue because we saw it was popping up, as a kind of favorable model for the European Commission for possible follow-ups to the recovery funds, but maybe also for the big EU budget, maybe if there's going to be new agricultural policy reforms. And then we started to think, yeah, how is it actually, working, and what is actually the effect? And in a way, it's a bit similar to the debate on sanctions. We know that sanctions of the EU are not always effective because they can often be circumvented, blah, blah, blah. But you still want to do it sometimes to give a political signal. So I would like to make this point, conditionality is also sometimes maybe a political signal. But that being said, if you then really look into it, you see that, for instance, with the recovery funds, if you look, for instance, at the midterm evaluation by the European Court of Auditors, that it does create a lot of extra red tape, and also that it is linked to fields where the regulations are not so clear. So what we have seen is that it can also be, for the European Commission, be used against you, because on what grounds exactly legally are you holding up money, and will this hold in front of the European Court of Justice? And in that respect, conditionality also gives a lot of power to the European Commission. And is the European Commission, does it have the capacity and the political weight to pick up these fights with individual member states to ensure this this field? So it's topics like socio-economic policies, but also organization of judiciaries, democratic policies, and in the future maybe defense. So is the Commission really able to do it? And what do you do, for instance, if a member state says, well, we've organized this, look, here's our new law, but you know that in reality, maybe the implementation is not there in the same countries. Do you have the capacity to really prove this? Can this hold up in front of the European Court of Justice? So that's why we entitled our paper, be careful for what you wish for. Because the question is really, is this conditionality something that can really be acting as a credible instrument? And if you should apply it in the future to the EU's bigger budget, how is that going to play out? Because of course all the member states pay into this budget, and if you're then going to uphold this funding, it might even be bigger clashes than you were, say, with the recovery funds. But anyways, that being said, I also realize, and that might be one of the questions that we might wish to talk about, what are the alternatives and what are the instruments that you do have available if you don't want to, let's say, use budgetary punishments to keep countries, of course, there's the Article 7 issue. But yeah, what kind of instruments do you have at your disposal at the EU level? Anyways, and that brings me to my second issue that I wanted to talk about in the intervention. And that is about the question of, let's say, the future need for investments. So we're still waiting the Draghi reports, but we already know what he's more or less going to say. We need way more money, public, private money, for the big challenges to keep our competitiveness position in the world. How are we going to do that? How are we going to organize that? I think that was kind of behind the scenes what didn't came out so much in the Dutch election campaign, but I think that was one of the big topics of the elections. Are we going to go for common new European investments, or are we going to set the frameworks in Brussels and depend on national investments at the national level? And that's also where I think the right and let's say the liberal left, right on the one hand and the liberal left on the other hand, diverge. That there is a clear push by people like Letta, Draghi, let's say the liberals and the left and the Greens for, let's say, common new European programs and expenditures, transboundary, reinforced in industrial policy, to go for new transboundary green investments, digital, and also, of course, defense industry. Whereas the radical rights, but perhaps also the conservative rights, seem to be, looking more towards, let's say, setting the frameworks perhaps in Brussels, but leaving it to the national member states to fund these investments. And then, of course, the question is, if that's going to be a national affair, do you get unwarranted competition? How does that relate to the internal market? And also, how do we then avoid, let's say, again, the 27, national defense industries having different systems, not maybe having the skill to compete at the global level, and so on and so forth. So we see at the moment also from a strategic autonomy perspective that the EU really is still too dependent clean energy and also the critical raw materials linked to it. On digital services, if we send an email, most likely that will go through the US at some point in time. All our strategic data are secured on clouds in the US. If we increase our defense spending, a lot of it will be spending in the US for new weapon systems and defense. So we are at the moment still highly dependent. And even for energy, even if we have less gas from Russia, we are still a high dependency on the Gulf states, on petrostates, and also again the US. So if the situation between the US and China is going to deteriorate, we're critical raw materials from China and from many other things very much dependent on China, or US on other things. So to what extent can we steer our own course? And that's of course the big question, and also the big reason why Draghi was asked, to say, how do we get our act together and increase this resilience and strategic autonomy? And I know this is a difficult term, so it's now kind of partially replaced by economic security. But in the end of the day, that's the same idea of becoming, less dependent on unwarranted dependencies. So, in general, I think everybody gets the idea. So, we need to get our act together. We need to have bigger funding for industrial policies. But then the question is, how do we do it? Are we just going to throw subsidies? Well, in my own country, in the Netherlands, in the 1980s, we tried to rescue a whole shipbuilding industry that we used to have in the Netherlands. We spent, millions of euros or guilders at that time into it. We lost 200,000 jobs in the end, and we didn't manage to rescue our shipbuilding industry. So, in terms of industrial policy, there is also quite a high risk, and that's of course also the risk what the Chinese have done with all their subsidies and state-owned companies, and also what the US is doing with its Inflation Reduction Act. Whereas in the EU, we have a polluter pays principle policy with the emissions trading scheme, and we have different approach. So we have a mix of polluter pays, subsidies, but as the companies rightly complain about, it's very complicated, it's cumbersome. But isn't it also the case that these companies that complain about it usually also have the best lobbyists to get these funding, and are not necessarily, let's say, the unicorns and the new small and medium enterprises that have to make our economies more resilient in a longer term perspective? So I think, well, the Letta report already said a lot of things about this need for more smart internal markets and smart industrial policies. And so not only, let's say, throwing big amounts of subsidies so that CEOs and shareholders of big multinationals can become richer. But I think this requires some more thoughts. And of course, we have Mariana Mazzucato has some ideas on that. So what are we also asking back? For instance, if we invest in a common European defense industry, akin the Airbus model, what are we going to ask back from these industries? Are we, for instance, claiming that they should also contribute more to the energy transition with their R&D facilities? And how do we avoid, let's say, public money going to the drain, going to waste? So yeah, I think these are, let's say, my thoughts. It's also questions. I think in the summer, lots of people will help writing the new political guidelines of the European Commission, the mandates for the new commissioners, and it's materialize in Brussels. Let's hope, yeah, these will be clever ideas, and that also the Draghi report will come up with some innovative approaches, so that we really boost our economies, and also think about how the distributional effects of these policies are linked to it. Linked, let's say, to the policies and the convergence of regions in the EU, and to hope that speakers will also feel that they have expertise in that. I leave it here. Thank you, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for your time limit. And frankly speaking, just before giving the floor to the others, I just mentioned that Mr. Rutte, in Hungary, he's the Dutch guy. It was very interesting. It was very interesting story, that when you had the last MFF discussion that achieved first the rebate without the British. Second, what was also very interesting to me, to increase from 10% again to 25% of the possible share of the costs, a possible share in order to cover the costs of the customs procedure in the member states when customs payment is necessary. So I think that maybe, how to say, the integrationist and solidarity thinking without the egoist national thinking of the governments is very, very important, even in the Netherlands. It's a very short issue. And I think that it's also very interesting what you talked about the conditionality, because when we had the accession talks, it was always in my mind when we had the talk that we have adopted a law, a government resolution, or whatever, set up an institution, that with the conditionality, when we get the level of sufficiency for the work of this institution, and it was always a never-ending discussion on the conditionality between a state, a member state, and the competent institution, that when it is necessary, develop to have the institution or the enforcement forces and so on. I just mentioned it to you that it's a never-ending story, and now as a nightmare, it comes back again for me under a new generation program and the others. The second is, I think, only to have a short food for thought for the other panelists, that whether the money, the 1% of the EU GNI is enough for everything which we want to do, because we have got internal policies, external policies, foreign policy, defense policy, as you said, for Hungarian presidency, it will be again a topic for reflection at least. But first of all, we have to increase our competitiveness, the EU. So we have got a lot of challenges, and what to do with that. Also with this new generation program, something has come to my mind, that as we said, that in Hungary, if we go into a bad way after the disciplined way, namely that the EU budget can never be indebted, and with the NGEU we stepped over the Rubicon, And now I can see that also the Ukrainian fund and the others will also come to this. So once you go behind the Rubicon River, if it is a river, not a river, when can we stop and whether we can confine everything into the 1% rule or we have to enlarge it, because as we see that the European Union has slowed down economic growth. That is one major worries of the questions. It's only a short story. The second is the climate and the dependency of the energy. Just to reflect on you, I think it's a very interesting moment. With the renewables, of course, we can also increase our independency of the traditional resources. You are right. So it's quite important. And with our own chips policy, with our own, you mentioned the digitalization story that we discussed with each other in 2 European buildings through the United States. So I think that, of course, we can think about it on the dependency ratios. But on the climate side, people saw that we, the Europeans, we are a little bit exaggerating the story and maybe we are going too far. Like the engine stories by 2035 and the others that we are a bit against our competitiveness and we are exaggerating with the possible renewable and climate-oriented approach. It's only a very short remark. There is a big discussion here as well. We are waiting for the Draghi report and Letta also has written one report. So these are very important questions. And how to move further with the internal market, state aid, as you said, and the other policies. So these are very important challenges that now I will stop here. I was too long. So I give the floor for the next plenary. So as we agreed, maybe it will be you, Ákos. Yes. If you want to come out, you can. The micro is enough there. Yes. Let's go.
Okay, it works. Does it work? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, dear participants. I would like to welcome you, and it is a big honor, big pleasure to be here and to share my views on the challenges of the EU budget. Basically, I would like to share my main considerations about the problems of the EU budget, or with other words, the characteristic features in general and their impacts on the future design and future planning of the next MFF. Let me tell you some main considerations, some main points. First of all, something about the size of the budget. Everybody knows that it is a very limited budget, even as Zsolt already mentioned, it is just about 1% of the GNI of the EU, and even if we take into account also the NGEU, even it is less than 2%. So we can't have big expectations from this budget. It is a very limited budget. It is a very, very low level compared to the GNI of the EU. We should also know that there are very different functions which are fulfilled by this EU level budget. So when we compare the EU level budgetary functions to the national level budgets, we can have an experience that it is a totally different type of budget, and even we should also know that there are very different EU level competencies. So when we are talking about the tasks for the EU level budgetary expenditures, we should also know that there are competencies, or on the other hand, there are not competencies at the EU level to support or to intervene in some fields. So just very shortly, when we are talking about the classical functions, we should conclude that the EU budget was basically designed to fulfill allocative and distributive or redistributive functions because of the decisive role of the two traditional policies. Everybody knows the agricultural policy and the cohesion policy. Their share within the budget was above 80, then above 70, 75% in the previous programming periods. But even during the current MFF, it is just above 60%. So these are the most important expenditure headings in this respect. So it is, I think, a clear evidence that the EU budget fulfills basically these two budgetary functions. However, we should also know that other classical big fields which can play a crucial role in a national budget are not managed at EU level. So, with other words, these are untouched functions or fields like, the big welfare or redistributive classical fields like healthcare, pension system, defense, even education policy, and so on. So these big systems are not financed from the EU budget. I would also include another consideration. I call it a development function, because even in the case of the regional policy, the cohesion policy, we all know that it is not just about redistribution. So it is not just to make transfers from richer member states through the EU budget towards less developed member states and regions. No, it is not the case at all. It is basically about improving the main preconditions for strengthening competitiveness and the economic base or background of the given country and region. So it has a clear development function. And in addition, as you all know, there are some important smaller policies like R&D policy at EU level. On the other hand, trans-European networks related policies, or the Connecting Europe facility, and the Erasmus Plus program in the field of educational programs. So all of these smaller policies were really strengthened, and their budget increased radically during the past MFFs, past 7-year periods. However, even nowadays, they remained relatively small part of the expenditures. We should also know that when we are talking about the classical big function, the stabilization function, we shouldn't have high expectations from the EU level budget because of its limited size. Clearly, it is not enough to support seriously stabilization functions through fiscal policy. But in some respect, again, the cohesion policy transfers can play a role in this field. And in addition, there was a big change, or something started to be changed through the implementation of the NGEU within this program. As you know, the RRF can play an important role in supporting national structural reforms, and in this respect, the stabilization function can improve in the budget. I just inserted this figure to show you that in general, there is a redistributive effect of the EU level budget when we have a look at the net position as an annual average based on the past programming period. We can have an experience that through the EU budget there is a clear redistribution. So against this very limited size, the transfers, I think we can say, represent a relatively important source for modernization as a kind of external resource, external channel of financial channel of resources for the main beneficiary countries of the EU budget. You can see that the annual transfers reached 3 or 4% of the GNI of the given countries on one hand, and on the other hand we should also emphasize that the sacrifice is not so high on the side of the net contributors, because their position was around 0.3% of their GNI, so it is not a high level burden on them. Let me continue with another characteristic feature of the budget, the revenue side. Everybody knows that there is a problem how to finance the budget because there are no real genuine own resources of the EU budget, with the exception of the customs duties. So there is a kind of dependence on the national contributions, GNI-based contributions, plus the VAT-based contribution is, as you know, also coming from the national budget. So basically, we are talking about more than 80–85% of the EU budgetary revenues, which are coming from the national budget. So there is no kind of financial autonomy to finance the EU budget. And it is a crucial issue if we will not have autonomous new resources, new own resources available for financing the EU level budget, then it will be very hard to reform also the expenditure side of the budget, because there is a lack of enough financial resources, and as we have this experience from the previous discussions about the MFF. Concerning the expenditure side, we should again refer to the problem that the two traditional policies share remained dominant, remained very high in the budget. So, and if there is a limited budget, there are limited resources, then if we will have new priorities or new strategic goals to be financed, then we can find money only from these traditional policies. So we have this experience again. There were serious cuts in the budget of the CAP and the cohesion policy in the current MFF and even in the previous one, because money was needed for new priorities. So the restructuring is possible only to save money in the budgets of these two traditional policies. On the other hand, we should also mention that because of the pandemic and other big challenges happened, long-term and short-term and medium-term challenges as well, there was a very important decision, very important breakthrough during the negotiations on the current MFF, namely to introduce the NGEU program, and it resulted a very different approach, because as we all know, the EU can issue debt, so bonds. So there is a new type of relatively new, because in some previous programs there were some limited experience in this respect, but the NGEU was really a game changer in this respect, because it allowed borrowing for spending. And it is a big question whether this type of approach will remain part of the future discussion and future design of the next MFF or not. It is an open question. Officially, nobody said until now that there will be this NGEU type instrument in the next MFF, but we have an experience, and maybe we can discuss about it later, but maybe it can be said that we have a positive experience. So in this respect, it can become part of the system under new initiative, obviously, because as you know, officially the NGEU will finish its operation until the end of 2026. The time frame is limited in this respect. I just inserted these figures, but we will not have time to have a look at in details, just to have an impression about the long-term changes and some major changes in the current MFF, and just again an overview, but again we have no time to go into details about the debate on the MFF and NGEU and the final results and the share of different expenditure headings at the end of the discussion. Maybe these figures are better to show the importance of the NGEU, because it was really added to the traditional MFF, and it was channeled to the most important fields. Basically, I would like to call your attention on the expenditure heading on cohesion and resilience, where the majority of the NGEU funds were channeled through the RRF instrument. Well, this will be the last slide, so don't worry. I try to be remain within the time frame. So something about the dilemmas which should be discussed, or maybe during the negotiations or preparation for the negotiation on the future MFF should be taken into account. First of all, there is a path dependence. So I think we can emphasize that it is a very technocratic, bureaucratic, rule-based decision-making system. So the changes are slow, and there is only a possibility for gradual changes within the budget. So the future MFF will be based on the current one and the experience gained in this period. However, taking into account what I mentioned before, the positive experiences of common borrowing and the NGEU experience. The second idea which should be emphasized, that I think everybody agrees that the EU level expenditures should be based on European added value, which means that we have mutual benefits, there are synergies, there are European public goods, and this is the reason why we decide together to finance some policies, some strategic goals through the EU level budget. So it is not just the net position which should be you know, in the center of the discussions. Unfortunately, it is always the case that everybody, I mean each member state, would like to concentrate on their net position, but it is very misleading and very bad message and very bad focus of the discussions. But on the other hand, we should also know that the European public goods as a notion, as a term, are not defined well. So there is a very confused approach in this respect. There are some researchers who say, for example, that the common agricultural policy is a European public good, for example. We can discuss about it, but on one hand, we can understand why, because of providing environmental public goods. But anyway, so it is a very difficult category, so we should find some definitions and some common approach about defining the contents of European public goods. And the next dilemma or important feature, I think that it is basically an investment budget. So basically, we would like to support those fields where there is a common understanding that we have common goals, and we would like to help structural modernization and reforms everywhere, so to contribute to strengthening cohesion and catching up and development. So the connected question is how to finance, and it could be a real innovation in the future, because it is just one possibility to finance our common goals through the own resources. The other option is to include more private contribution in some fields, in some policy areas. It is possible to, to think about the PPP construction, but in several cases it is impossible because the private sector is not interested in. But in general, co-financing rate, even it could be public money or private money, can be increased to find more money. And on the other hand, the common borrowing as an experience of the NGEU, it is a big question. Even it could be another debate, another discussion, whether common borrowing, so loans, can be concerned or treated as an own resource, because even it is a big question, maybe it sounds provocative, but if you read the treaty, the own resource as a term, as a notion, is not defined properly in the treaty. It is just mentioned in the treaty that the EU budget is financed by own resources, but there is no definition. Unanimity voting is needed in the council, but obviously it is an open question whether loan, common borrowing, could be kind of new own resource. Last two remarks, both stability and flexibility are needed. Again, everybody agrees that a kind of stability is needed, kind of predictability is needed because of multi-annual programming, and because of strategic approach in several fields, like in R&D projects or cohesion policy related projects. Obviously, it gives a high degree of stability. So it is very important to have a stable framework. But on the other hand, as we experienced during the past 1.5 decades, there are several various, very different crises happened, and some flexibility is needed. So some restructuring is needed, some bigger margins are needed, or even some restructuring between headings, among budgetary expenditure headings, could be an option, could be a future options to increase the flexibility of the EU budget in the future. So it is again an open question what to do in this respect, stability contra flexibility, or with other words, we can also think about this dilemma as an investment-oriented budget or crisis management-oriented budget, because crisis management oriented budget means or requires more flexibility, because we don't know what kinds of new crisis situation can emerge in the future. So this is why flexibility would be needed, and a high level flexibility would be needed. And finally, as a general remark, conditionality, even as it was previously mentioned, it can play a crucial role, a general one, kind of rule of law conditionality in connection with sound financial management. But on the other hand, I think what is very important to have performance-based indicators clearly defined in the future. And again, we have an experience in the case of the, maybe it is too complex in the case of the RRF, but I think it is a good direction to connect the European semester and the implementation of the structural reforms and monitoring the achieved targets and milestones. But there shouldn't be too much from these indicators. I think, like in the case of the previous Europe 2020 strategy, it was very well focused. There were clear targets, or even nowadays in relation to the European Green Deal, we have clear indicators, obviously. So specific national level, specific country-specific indicators should play a crucial role, but a kind of clear structure of indicators should be implemented in the future, just to strengthen the transparency of the monitoring process and implementation. Okay, so I would like to stop here, and maybe in the discussion we can return to some points. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ákos. It was very nice. And you strengthened my conclusion before I giving the floor to István. Namely that I spoke about the Dutch, that, you know, they asked for the rebate and the 25% of the customs cost and so on. And they don't pay. That is what I always said, that there is no so-called contributor member states to the common budget, net contributor, which pays more than 0.5% of the GNI. So with egoism, I think we should be very cautious. The second is the resources, which was also very interesting in that case. I just try to provoke you for the further discussions. Whether new own resources would come, or the ministers of finance should say that no new resources, only the 1%, which is around the GNI of the Hungarian state, as a plafond. So we have got so many questions. But not speaking about the member state budget discipline with the stability and growth pact and the others, they say that I don't want to pay more. Okay, let's use the common budget. The common budget says that you have to use the national budget for different costs. Sometimes charges are paid by the EU budget. In Hungary, we know about the part of the salary of the teachers nowadays, that sometimes you have to recourse to the state charges from the EU budget, which is not a really investment-oriented story. So we can speak about a lot of questions, and we can see the limits of the whole budgetary policy and the traditional policy and the new policy and the contradiction between them. Okay, now I will suspend here and I will give the floor to István. István, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Certainly, I have my personal opinion on both conditionality and EU common budget. But as we discussed it earlier, with regard to my presentation of today, I'd like to contribute to this panel by discussing not EU level, but national level budgetary policies, and whether some sort of a, let's say, preference convergence has arrived in terms of national budgetary policies or not in the EU in the last 20 years. Why the last 20 years? Because my perspective is basically the perspective of Central and Eastern European member states, the 11 member states. And as you all know, the last 20 years, long period, was a success story in terms of economic development and catching up. Even the least developed country of EU 27, Bulgaria, managed to reach roughly 2/3 of EU average as of today, and it started its journey 20 years ago at 1/3, so it's quite a remarkable economic development. The same with Romania, the country where was somewhere around the level of Bulgaria at the time of accession, and nowadays actually it's at the level of Poland and Hungary. So it's quite a remarkable economic convergence. And actually, except for Slovenia, which was at the beginning quite quite developed already, all the other countries managed to converge quite substantially. So my question in my latest research has been whether this sort of convergence in terms of economic development has been translated into convergence of fiscal policies as well, both in terms of size, as the Wagner law famously hypothesizes it, namely that economic growth, economic convergence implies in the longer run a more sizable general budget as well, not just in absolute terms, but also in measured to the GDP. And actually, my answer in terms of size is quite simple. No, not at all. The Wagner law has not been verified, which means that, as you can see here, whereas the EU 27's general government, both on the expenditure and the revenue side, has been around somewhere 45%. Most of the Central and Eastern European countries have not reached that level yet, except for 3, Hungary, Slovenia, and Croatia. Nevertheless, these 3 countries have not been the most successful countries in terms of economic developments. As I told you, Slovenia actually, compared to its initial conditions, achieved the least. So in this sense, it's more like an initial condition. It was the case in the 90s as well, already, even at the time of the political and economic change 35 years ago. And as you can see here, other countries have been or still are below or way below the EU 27 average, sometimes even with the total standard deviation, which is around 6 percentage points, which means that countries like Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, or Lithuania actually have a preference for a relatively small budget, general budget, of being below 40%, actually 37, 38%, which is in any sense not comparable to countries like France, the 3 Nordic countries, Belgium, or Austria, well above the 50% level. So in terms of size, nothing surprising in a sense that the Wagner law has been not verified and there has been no convergence seen. But it's more interesting to ask the question whether in terms of composition, nevertheless, some sort of let's say, preference convergence occurred or not. And just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to highlight here 3 items of revenues and 5 items of expenditures. Regarding expenditures, compensation of public sector employees on the EU level is something like 1/4 of total spending. So every 4th euro is spent on compensating public sector employees, whereas social transfers in cash has always been the most substantial part. Roughly 1/3 of the general budget has been spent on social transfers in cash. Social transfers in kind is something like 25%, so 1/4 of the general budget. Again, in terms of EU 27, gross fixed capital formation is something around 8.5%. If, again, we take into account the EU's average. And as far as the last is concerned, interest payments, it has been around 4% in the last 20 years. Regarding taxation, I mean, how a national government can finance these expenditures, direct taxes and social security contributions accounted for roughly 1/4 each, whereas indirect taxation has always been the most preferred one, something like 1/3. Now, and here comes the question. If we take into account what a country prefers in terms of collecting revenues, in terms of spending on, then we can create kind of clusters. Here I used basically the relative variation of these countries. So how far these countries have been away from the mean, their own mean values. And as you can see here, now just focusing on the countries which are not from Central and Eastern Europe, you can see here that most of the original member states prefer to spend on social transfers. Nevertheless, there's a line, quite a demarcation line between 2 groups, even within the old member states. Luxembourg, Italy Portugal, Germany, Austria, and Spain on the one hand, which prefer cash type transfers paid to households, whereas on the other hand, we have the Nordic countries, Ireland, Belgium, Netherlands, and France, which prefer rather providing social transfers in terms of like kindergartens, schooling, whatever, so which is in kind, right? Gross fixed capital formation, interestingly, with regard to the non-CE member states, has not been preferred, again, in relative terms. So we are focusing here on not the absolute levels, but in relation to other spending items, what do they prefer? Whereas compensation of public sector employees, two small countries, Malta and Cyprus and Denmark, proved to be quite generous. And as far as financing these, as you can see here, both direct taxes and social security contributions have been quite remarkably used. But the interesting thing here is again that the continental, let's say, core countries such as Germany, Austria, or Netherlands and France prefer social contributions, whereas the Nordic countries would opt for direct taxes like personal income taxation or corporate taxes. Now, if we add now the Central and Eastern European countries, then the picture would become rather biased, let me put it this way. You can see here the Central and Eastern European countries. The first thing is that where Central and Eastern European countries, most of them appear is gross fixed capital formation. On the one hand, we can argue that it's a certain fact because they have been in a laggard position. So their economic convergence basically requested them to spend so much. But it's only one thing. The other thing is you guys, I mean, the European Union. The European Union caused such a biasness, certainly, because this is, as Akos just actually explained us, this is what the European Union finances, gross fixed capital formation. Why is this to some extent problematic? Because in the future, and this was actually quite nicely highlighted in Akos's presentation as well, in the future, it's not really gross fixed capital formation. I mean, public investment, what matters, especially in countries like, let's say, Estonia, or in Slovenia, or in Czechia, which are already at 90% of the EU average, but welfare. And welfare institutions, welfare payments have been rather neglected in many of these countries, Hungary being the least generous of all, but it's to some extent explained by the fact that Hungary is basically paying a lot on interest payments. So bad decisions of the past is basically means a huge burden on Hungary. And on the other hand, as you can see, we have here Slovenia and Slovakia, which nevertheless seem to prefer something similar to the core countries, basically relying on cash. As far as the revenue side is concerned, as you can see here, direct taxes have not been preferred at all Central and Eastern European countries. Why not? Because we compete on wages, we compete on taxes with old member states, so that's why no preference convergence can be seen here. Nevertheless, as far as indirect taxes are concerned, you can see here that Bulgaria, Croatia, and Hungary tend to rely on it quite substantially. Plus, social security contributions have been also rather important. Again, these are not absolute values, but relative values compared to other things. What can we say relying on this data with regard to the future? Well, if the EU budget needs to be reconsidered sooner or later, and these countries, most of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, are about to reach the 90% GDP level, average GDP level, then of course something else should be financed, or something differently, somehow differently should be finance the, let's say, the development process of these countries. And actually, it's the welfare. Our prime minister famously argued that we Hungarians do not want to copy the uncompetitive Western European welfare structures. Instead, we actually try to capitalize on what the government calls a kind of a workfare economy. Cheap labor, right? Skilled and cheap labor. What is the implication of it? Well, the unfortunate implication of it is that migration can have a rather different, I mean, internal migration will have a very different, let's say, characteristic in the future. Up until now, most of the Central and Eastern European people went abroad to old member states to get a decent job. And it was basically labor migration what mattered, and remittances helped the people stay at home. In the future, it will be different, or even today. It's basically people with young children who may decide and do decide to actually relocate themselves abroad. Why? Because the welfare system is more generous in terms of, let's say, education, which is #1 issue for a family with children. Also, elderly people are not on the radar of many countries, typically, but nevertheless, in the future, internal migration can or should have a more actually intense focus on elderly retired people as well, because actually, if health is not an issue and health somehow is not cured by EU budget, or at least in terms of thinking about what we can do, then again, an internal migration can be seen. I'm only 50, but what I'm constantly thinking about, which is the country in Western Europe where I would like to actually retire when I get old, because I don't want to get treated actually in my country. So basically, that's kind of a different migration, and I think these preferences clearly demonstrate that kind of a different, let's say, understanding of common priorities needs to be established. This is one thing. So instead of an investment fund, more about welfare or social security, what is need to be, let's say, rethought. The other thing is that when we talk about welfare, 1% is not enough for anything. So it would imply a significant increase in terms of EU budget, where again, the revenue side will become a very important issue as well. And I'm stopping here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, István. It was very nice, again, thought-provoking contribution. And before giving the floor to Miklós on the post-present MFF periods and post-2030, 2027 period dilemmas, I think it will be very interesting to go to the top. I would mention that it was very interesting to hear about the revenue and the distribution factor of the national budgets and thinking. I just have only one joke when we were told that even the island is one of the most or the wealthiest state of the EU. They have got only 28% of the redistribution level, which is extremely very low. The level. They said that, well, okay, they don't have professional footballs, even if they have got the level of GDP or GMI, because they know that what they can expect from the state and what. But the different type of approach for the state budget distribution and revenues, it was very interesting to hear. István. So I give the floor to Miklós. Do you want to remain here with the micro or to come out on the strategic dilemmas? Okay, we shall give you one of the micro. Thank you very much. I give the floor.
And the most important priorities should be most urgent priorities. There is a slight difference between the terms important and urgent. The urgent priorities of the EU. Anyway, the European Commission will submit its proposal about the new multi-annual financial framework in June 2025. The starting point of my intervention is related to the relationship between the budget and the ambitions, the values, the political and policy priorities of the European Union. In other words, the function of the purpose of the budget is to ensure the necessary financial means of their implementation, that is the implementation of policies, the achievement of political objectives, things like that. Therefore, the size and the structure of the budgetary disbursements and revenues determine the achievement of the set objectives. To put it simply, what it finances, how it finances, and how it is financed, these are the major the slogans related to the EU budget. Of course, there is a path dependence, as Ákos pointed out. I don't take part about this discussion issue. The new and substantial debates can be made about the importance of the historical heritage. Maybe the past dependence is not such strong as it is assumed. I don't know. I don't want to take part about this dilemma. The present budget has not been reformed substantially since 1988. It is over complicated, obscure, and it is inherently difficult to reform, as Ákos has already pointed out the difficulties. The EU is facing external and internal challenges. Some of them are long-term challenges, others are at work in the short term. The external challenges are quite well known. The geopolitical situation is the first and most important challenge, including Russia's war against Ukraine, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, the Red Sea conflict. Another external challenge is the unreliability of transatlantic partnership, US elections, decoupling from NATO, strategic autonomy, defense. These issues have been touched upon yesterday and this morning at this conference. Another challenge is the migration, asylum, refugees, things like that, the green transition and digital transition. Growing protectionism is also a challenge. However, I would like to note that according to some preliminary calculations, the budgetary revenues of the EU would increase by about 2 billion euros per annum if the new tariff rates on Chinese electric vehicle imports are levied. So protectionism has sometimes advantages as well. But this was a minor remark. Again, the growing subsidies in the world, the IREA and in the US and China are also external challenges. I think from the point of view of the future of the EU budget, the internal challenges are more important and more relevant. First of all, the future development of the EU is at stake. In what direction is the EU going to develop? There are two simplified approaches, the federalist approach calling for fiscal federalism, implying perennial centralization of regulations, transfer of power to EU institutions, shifts in the balance of power, and constitutional changes, of course. The sovereignist approach emphasizes the looser relationship among member states. In short, Europe of strong member states is the objective. There are other concepts about the future development of the European Union. French-German study group elaborated the four-layer or four-circle scheme of the European Union. The first layer is the deep integration, including the economic and monetary union and the Schengen area. The second part includes the European Union as it is today. In the third circle, the association countries belong, that is the countries with which accession negotiations are going on, the new member state candidates. And finally, the European Community is the fourth circle, comprising all the other countries which do not belong to the first three layers. Anyway, these are the general political frames of the future development of the European Union. There are specific problems, however, related to the EU budget. The first specific problem is the financing of the RRF. After 2028, there will not be financial means for repaying the loans. The increase of inflation rates causes additional problems and lays extra burden on the budget. The conditionality of the budget is another problem. We have already touched upon this issue together with the Hungarian colleagues. There are question marks about the own resources. The next internal challenge is the proliferation of extra budgetary items, the European Development Fund, the Peace Facility, the new fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Finally, solving the trilemma should be solved. Net contributors want to curb remittances to the EU. The defenders of the present policies want to retain what they have. And other member states want the EU to spend more on emerging policies. Only two of the three can be satisfied. And the responses to these external and internal challenges go beyond 2027. That is the end of the present multi-annual financial framework. I found a very interesting paper written by Andrew Duff and Louise Garicano, entitled "The Two-Tier Budget for the EU." According to their proposal, there should be two separate parts of the EU budget. The present EU budget should be split into two separate parts. To a top federal tranche, and this is the first part, and the lower confederal part would be the other component of the EU budget. The objective of the top federal tranche would be to finance the delivery of European public goods paid for by genuine own resources, raised through an EU treasury located in the European Commission. The new element is the European treasury, the EU treasury. We have some knowledge about the public goods and the problems related to genuine own resources, how to raise these resources. The public goods, what about the public goods? It is also, well, I fully agree with you, of course, that it is difficult to define the term public good. It should be inclusive, it should add value, it should attain economies of scale at the pan-European level, and it should be consensual and consistent with the EU's political objectives. There are examples. Public goods include the administrative costs of the EU, public investments in green and digital transition, cross-border energy supplies, science research. I did not find the common agricultural policy in the list of public goods. Anyway, they should catalyze further development and dynamize these public goods, the development of the European Union. Public goods should be large and flexible to cope with current and future tasks belonging to the supranational authority. To be some more specific, the next generation EU, the support to Ukraine, the inclusion of the European Stability Mechanism and the Single Resolution Fund should be incorporated in the top federal tranche of the EU budget. Of course, this calls for the increase of the size of the budget. It is very small, but let me make a remark about this. The annual size of the EU budget corresponds to the complete GDP of 10 EU member states. Of course, the two figures cannot be compared directly because of substantial differences in the definition of the two terms. But anyway, it shows that from this point of view, the EU budget is quite or maybe quite significant. Of course, it does not question the conclusions of and István. But anyway, what should be the size of the EU budget? The authors did not present any firm stand about it, but I think it should be it should correspond to 10% of the member states, 7 to 10% of the member states. But this sum includes the lower confederal part of the budget. This component of the budget should continue to be supplied by national GNI contributions to support those domestic policies implemented by central and regional or local governments, such as the common agricultural policy and the structural funds. Another question mark is how to raise the additional revenues to finance these policies. There are controversial experience with common borrowing, and of course, any change would require the unanimous agreement, consent of the member states. I think this is the most, this is the toughest limiting factor of implementing these ideas. I think in the next few years, we will read some other ideas, proposals about long-term problems of the EU budget. This was only one actual paper which will be presented to the European Commission to discuss, consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very good and very nice summary of the dilemmas coming out from the next future budget. But I think that the more policy we raise and emerge to be financed, including the enlargement, the so-called external stories, and also we want to follow on somehow with the two traditional big trenches, as it was indicated by Ákos, the cap and cap related and the convergence related stories. We have to find out something, and we heard some very good ideas and thinking from Miklós, so it was very nice. With this two trenches, two-tier system, the federalist and the sovereignist, for me, one thing is a very good lesson, that we cannot be sovereignist when we want to contribute to the EU budget, to the EU common policies, and we cannot be federalist when we want to receive many things from the EU. There are no two types of behavior on the revenue and on the contribution side for everybody, including the Dutch as well, because with the 2 billion euro coming from an extra customs, I think if most of this will be charged by custom in Rotterdam, the Dutch budget will take €500 million only from that as an extra income for Mr. Rutte. But now I will finish it. I'm dear Louisa. I just wanted to make, I did since you will pay it for the NATO. Yes. So I think that there is no free lunch, and we cannot say that on the revenue and on the expenditure side, you have got two different types of behavior and approach of the EU or related to the EU. It's only a very short message what we have to think over during the Hungarian presidency.